Welcome. I'm Jennifer Choo, Director of Research and Strategy at the Center for China Analysis, and I'm delighted you're joining us for this conversation, how China's young generation is redefining mental health care from the therapy room to the chatbot. Over the past 3 decades, China has moved from widespread silence and stigma around mental illness to a rapidly expanding culture of therapy, psychological self-examination, mental health awareness. It's a remarkable transformation. Within living memory, distress in China was something that was personal, largely endured privately, absorbed into families, unnamed. Yet even as this new openness has flourished, demand for care has completely outstripped professional systems' capacity to meet it. And so increasingly, young Chinese are looking beyond the clinic to online communities, podcasts, therapy apps, and most recently, AI chatbots for emotional support, for companionship, even romance, and for ways of making sense of distress. Behind this shift of behavior is a broader transformation in how young people understand themselves, of course. This is a generation shaped by intense educational and workplace competition, slowing economic mobility, changing family structures, and accelerating technological change, dizzying changes. And in navigating all of that, young people have built a new vocabulary of inner life, the psychological language of anxiety, burnout, and boundaries, alongside the internet's own idioms of lying flat, tangping, letting it rot, bailan, and the wry pessimism of sound culture, sang wanhua. Youth anxiety, loneliness, the turn toward AI companionship. These actually echo similar strains being felt across the world. In the US, for instance, the Surgeon General declared loneliness and isolation an epidemic in 2023. The WHO estimates that even before COVID, nearly 1 billion people worldwide were living with a mental health condition, and only a small fraction were able to afford adequate, affordable care. What makes China distinctive, perhaps, is the compression of all of this, how fast this transformation is unfolded and at what scale. Which brings us to the tension, or perhaps the paradox at the heart of our conversation. Psychological awareness, expectations of emotional well-being have expanded faster than the institutions available to support them. At the policy level in Beijing, China's National Health Commission has publicly acknowledged the need to close gaps in mental health services, but young people are also improvising new ways of care. So in this conversation, we'll use China as a lens through which to examine much broader questions about mental health, technology, intimacy, and the future of care. What does this transformation tell us about the inner lives of young Chinese today? What does it tell us about the inner lives of young people in general? And what might it tell us about changes underway everywhere? So to explore this, we have 3 people who I cannot imagine is more qualified and interesting to talk about these topics than the 3 people before me. Barclay Bram is a fellow on Chinese society at CCA, a journalist at The Economist, and the producer of The Weekend Intelligence. An Oxford-trained anthropologist, he spent years researching mental health and psychological counseling in China. Yi-Ling Liu is a writer and editor covering technology, AI, and Chinese society, a journalist in residence at the Tarbell Center for AI Journalism, and the recent author of The Wall Dancers, Searching for Freedom and Connection on the Chinese Internet. She also leads the China desk at Rest of World, a nonprofit publication on technology, as its first China editor. And Wang Qing is a non-resident honorary fellow also at CCA and an award-winning independent journalist, co-founder and co-host of the Weirdo Podcast, 不合时宜, one of the leading Chinese language podcasts with more than 1 million subscribers, and a place perhaps where many young Chinese first heard of their own struggles spoken aloud. So welcome to all 3 of you. And let me turn to Barclay now to start the conversation. So Barclay, you've written a lot about mental health in China, the youth, and actually your research was on the rise of psychology, the psy-boom in China. So can you tell us a little bit more about that history, the evolution, and how it's transformed so quickly?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be here with such great thinkers. Yeah, so when we talk about the psy-boom in China, so this is sort of the rise of interest in psychological counseling, psychological services, and mental health more generally. And what's interesting about the psy-boom and this language is that it actually precedes the pandemic. So since the pandemic, there has been a huge explosion in interest in mental health in China. As we know, During zero COVID, China had some of the most strict lockdowns in the world. And at that time, suddenly people were locked at home, they were searching the internet, they were feeling anxious, they were feeling depressed. So you could see on websites like Baidu, search engines, suddenly these spikes in searches for terms like depression and anxiety. In fact, the searches for depression went up 300% during the Shanghai lockdown. So there was this huge moment after the pandemic in which, people suddenly became very aware of mental health and the need to, think about themselves as psychological subjects. But this is preceded actually in the literature by the psy-boom. And so this was actually coming out of the Mao era. So in the Mao era, you had psychology as an academic discipline was deemed a bourgeois pseudoscience. A lot of psychology professors were kicked out of their posts at universities. In some cases, they were struggled against in the Cultural Revolution. Some of them actually lost their lives. And so the discipline of psychology coming out of the Mao era in the late 1970s was very marginalized as a discipline. And so people didn't have this sort of academic understanding of psychology or mental health. Suddenly you have this spike, you have the rise in the market economy, and in the early 90s, and so in the late 80s, early 90s, you had teams of clinicians coming from America doing surveys of China. And what the Chinese doctors would show when they would bring these sort of American clinicians around is they'd say, mental health, like, not really a problem here. Like, if you do surveys, people, rates of depression here are extremely low. People are broadly happy. There's not a problem here. To which, lots of these American doctors would say, I just don't think you're studying that correctly. That doesn't really make sense. And at one point in the early 90s, there was this big nationwide survey which showed that China had a rate of depression 35 times lower than the US. And what happened, sort of the big sea change here, was in 1993, the World Health Organization issued a report, and it was called the Global Burden of Disease Report. And suddenly this changed the way that societies were supposed to look at disease and, the kind of burden of diseases. So before, they were supposed to look at mortality. So how likely any disease in a society was to kill people. The Global Burden of Disease report said, actually, economically, what is more costly is not a disease that kills someone. It's a chronic illness that has a high morbidity rate. So something that you can survive with, but is going to prevent you from working. So suddenly, diseases like heart disease, which can kill you fairly quickly, become less relevant if you're ranking the burden of that disease than mental health problems. So that was in 1993. And this was a wake-up call to the Chinese government. And then in 1999, the Chinese government hosted the World Health Organization. And they had this big conference in Beijing where they started to really think about mental health and what it would mean to do proper diagnostic testing and to expand psychological consciousness throughout society. So how do you get people to think about mental health, and how can you get people to become responsible in some way for their own mental health? And what the government kind of alighted on was creating a vocational qualification for psychological counseling. And so from the early 2000s through to 2017, you have this huge expansion of this vocational program where people could train to become psychological counselors. And in that time, roughly 1 million people trained. And concomitant to that is, the explosion of the internet, WeChat, and suddenly lots of people start talking about mental health, psychology. People start in, affluent areas, they start to seek out therapy. And this is sort of this nascent thing that's bubbling away. And then the pandemic happens. So this is sort of the long history into which the pandemic happens. And suddenly this boom, this kind of explosion of interest in mental health. But it is preceded by this long sort of wave of marketization, the opening up, the rise of individuality, the individual, and the resurgence of psychology as an academic discipline. So it's a sort of braided web of things that happen.
Amazing. Fascinating. So, Cheng, you've actually had people on your podcast, psychiatrists who actually practiced from way before there was a psy-boom. who describe, I guess, the psychological phenomenon more as like a neurasthenia, sort of as an illness, psychiatric thing to treat, and also patients. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how has sort of especially in urban China, perspective on mental health, how has it changed? And how has it become sort of described more as something that young people actually will reach for as they're feeling distress? And where is there still stigma around mental health?
Thank you for the question, and also thank you for having me. I just to follow up on Barclay's wonderful explanation of the the progress of China's mental health transformation. I think the real revolution that happened in mental health in China wasn't just medical; it was also linguistic, and I think that that has basically transformed how people perceive mental illness or just some sort of mental problems or mental issues. And so as I run a podcast, and we have mostly our audiences are young people in China, and we have guests on our show regularly. Talk about issues that concern them, and interestingly, I found a lot of the more popular episodes do concern perspective on mental health. It could be more clinically diagnose mental health issue like depression or anxiety or autism, or some sort of more general mental problem, or it could call mental discomfort, like fatigue or just anxiety or burnout. And so I do feel that I do observe that nowadays young people in China talk about mental health more openly than before. But of course, at the same time, the problems they are facing have also grown more complex. So it is a progress, but it is a progress with a lot of complexity. On the progress front, you could see that help seeking has become more normalized. Going to therapy, taking medication, posting openly about your mental issue. And none of that automatically raised as weak or crazy anymore, which was probably that case before. And secondly, I feel the vocabulary has also expanded, and we move from stigmatizing phrases like something have gone wrong with you to a more complex vocabulary system, and people don't just talk about those phrases that are used in a medical system, but also a lot of phrases become very popular. Like for instance, family of origin, 原生家庭 in Chinese, which has become a kind of a phenomenon. If you go on podcasts or social media platform, posts like this would receive a lot of comments and resonation. And then words like emotional labor or trauma responses. So sometimes you feel there is a big chunk of very interesting and somehow complicated psychological words that have entered the public sphere in China and are being discussed by a big chunk of Chinese audiences, sometimes in kind of amateur way, but it's good that it's being discussed now. So I think that is a form of empowerment in itself. Once you have the words, or once you have a dictionary that you can seek for the words, you can actually describe your experience and be understood. And I think thirdly, this is a little bit more surprising front, and I'm not taking it lightly. It's in some circles, having a mental health struggle is almost seen as something cool for younger generation. And again, I'm not taking this lightly, but I think it somehow resonates with the sort of social or collective mentality among Gen Z that being normal or being entirely normal isn't considered cool anymore. And there is a kind of like, structural overlap between being mentally normal and the, Gen Z's broader hunger for individuality. So we've seen, Gen Z icon like Billie Eilish, who is also very popular in China, being so open about, her lifelong mental health struggles, and that actually resonates deeply with her young fans. And therefore, like you work with some Gen Z friends, and we have like Gen Z audiences. He would sometimes joke, "Oh, I have recently diagnosed as ADHD, but I'm high functional ADHD." So you get that sort of like almost as an you feel like there's some sort of like open embrace to those phenomena that used to be considered as illness, and now it becomes some sort of like cultural identity. And I think that's like a very interesting trend that is going on. However, I think the picture overall has also gotten a little bit more complicated despite all the progress I described earlier. I think first, the source of distress have multiplied compared to previous generation. So it is no longer just, childhood trauma or work stress in isolation. It is a combination of a lot of different, like a lot of stress at a different level. Like, for instance, this sort of like evolution style competition, like 内卷 and uncertainty around like marriage and childbearing and the constant comparison by social media, and the economic downturn, and now the new anxiety about AI, which I believe Yi-Ling may talk a little bit more about that later on. And so I think it was stacking on top of each other and reinforcing one another. And secondly, I think there is still a big generation gap. So the generation gap in terms of, young people's own vocabulary has changed, but institution around them, like for instance, a family, a workplace, or the mental health system haven't fully caught up. So you end up in a kind of suspended state. Like young people, especially those like urban young people, have become more open in their thinking, but there isn't no like matching institutional support to catch them. And thirdly, I think which is also very important to mention is that right now we are seeing a lot of expression from young people online about being open about their mental well-being. However, I think these are still kind of limited to the urban reality. Like China also has a vast in the countryside. In the depression diagnosis rates in rural areas remain actually rather low if you look at the data. Yet suicidal rates in the countryside are strikingly high. So I think that tells you something, about the gap between rural and urban China are just very big, and they're dealing with a very different reality. So I think that is still a huge challenge that China needs to face now in terms of mental health. I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing in this disparity between rural and urban. I mean, I think often when we talk about China, it gets devoted towards urban China, but there's a vast, part of the population that live in rural China. So, Yi-Ling, though, I'm still struck by what Qing said in terms of sort of the convergence, some of the forces that Qing is talking about, the increasing complexity of living in today's world, especially for the younger generation. You wrote a very insightful op-ed in the New York Times and also have spoken about the convergence that you see between Silicon Valley, let's say, or the US and also in China. Can you tell us a little bit about that sort of macro forces that, maybe is facing the younger generation in general? And how would you sort of talk about the convergence and what's distinctively Chinese in all of this?
Yeah, just wanted to start off by saying I'm delighted to be in conversation with you all. I've thought so deeply about mental health in it, to see the kind of arc of Barclay talking about post-Mao China, when Shuku was the norm, up until like what Ting was mentioning about, people admiring Billie Eilish for speaking out about her mental health struggles. Interestingly, I feel like when I observe China today and its mental health landscape today, I can't help but notice, as I mentioned in the op-ed, the many ways in which it feels very similar to the United States in the way it would not have been, in the 80s and 90s. And so I think, there are several universal forces at play that shape that. I think the big one that I focus on is just like rapid, unprecedented, accelerating technological change, right? And the things that trickle down from that, I think the big forces are rampant inequality, a kind of deep-seated uncertainty about the future, kind of eroding structures of social and institutional support. All of those are things that I associate with both the US and China. And as a result of that, I think what I've observed is this shared sense of precarity, both among young Chinese and young Americans. There's this sense that those who kind of build and bankroll the technology, who are in Silicon Valley or in Zhongguancun, they often speak of the future as something exciting, something to be profited from, an opportunity to be exploited. Whereas the rest of us, who aren't part of, the cohort of young entrepreneurs and startup founders who are building AI companies, feel kind of disempowered and feel like they have no agency over the future. And so how I've kind of observed this sociologically and culturally is, and even linguistically, is in a kind of parallel set of memes that have emerged both in the US and China. For example, 996 Liu, which has always been kind of a big phrase in China to describe frustration with overwork and working hours, is now gone completely viral in Silicon Valley and is used almost earnestly by tech workers who are hustling really hard in hopes of escaping what they call the permanent underclass. Arguably, there's also this fear in China of not being sucked into the permanent underclass, of wanting to work really hard to kind of stay afloat and stay ahead. Another word that I've noticed that has come up is that of the NPC, which stands for non-player character. And it's essentially like a phrase that describes a role in a video game. So it's like the background role, the shopkeeper, the pedestrian in a video game, and people online are describing themselves as NPCs because they feel like they aren't protagonists in their own stories, right? They essentially exist to kind of fill the world, but not to be part of it and not to actually shape it. I see this also in the kind of similarities between a growing fascination with the spiritual. And so, in the United States, like, people are obsessed with astrology. CoStar, this online astrology app, has been doing very, very well. There's this kind of resurgence of interest in Christianity and religious conservatism, particularly among young Gen Zs. And in China, when I visited recently, there's just like this huge flourishing of like fortune telling bars, and also like astrology apps are going viral. And I think a lot of this is rooted in a desire for certainty and a desire for some kind of spiritual guidance at a moment where people are feeling very lost and disoriented. That being said, despite these similarities, there are of course differences between the kind of distress between of young people in China and the young people in the US. I think the one thing that one of many things that I would identify as unique to young Chinese is the kind of particular narrowness and myopia that they feel towards their paths towards the future. So, I think everyone feels hyper competitive. Everyone feels like there are fewer and fewer opportunities for them. But in China in particular, with education, there's really one path, right? Like, you take the Gaokao, you make it, you fail it, and that kind of is a determinant for you for the rest of your life, right? And I remember speaking with Professor Xiang Biao actually on for an Asia Society webinar, and he was saying, if a American young person decides not to go to university and instead drops out and works at McDonald's, it's not seen as like a huge failure. Like it's not necessarily seen as like this massive drop off the path to success in the way that it might be seen in China, right? They really, really have completely stepped off any ladder of success if you do that in China. So there's kind of like a more plural landscape of success, I think, still in the US. And then the other thing I would say is there's this like heightened disillusionment with having children and raising families in China in particular. I've sensed like, particularly among young women, this desire to not marry, not to have offspring, that is both kind of a form of empowerment, like this is the type of life that I want to live, but often kind of rooted in a bit of a disillusionment with the future. And so that's something that I've also noticed that is quite unique to China.
Very cool. That actually leads me to my next question, because Qing, you've had many people on your podcast to talk about the sort of the new attitude towards family, about having children, single mothers, and just newfound freedoms, you would say. And I'm just curious to find out where you think is sort of the new boundary or sort of the new definition of intimacy, and sort of also where does that lead in terms of loneliness and also kind of a search for new kinds of connection in China today?
Yeah, I think right now, China, especially Chinese young people, is going through a very interesting phase of having to redefine what kind of intimacy they want, what kind of sense of security they want, and what kind of freedom they want. And it, on the one hand, very empowering, because I think it's probably the generation that is given this sort of freedom for the first time, maybe in the entire Chinese history. But on the other hand, it means you somehow have to scratch, have everything scratch from the ground. Like you have to basically have a whole plans, like entirely based on your decision. You have to be the designer of your life, or the life of your community. And what I noticed interestingly through a few recent episodes that I from like single motherhood by choice to people who decided to spend their adult life together, but no form of a married couple. I feel freedom means the freedom to opt out of the script, but no the freedom to stop wanting connection. So the desire of wanting connection is still there. But young people in China now have like a really strong desire of having the connection and having the intimacy on their own term. So what they are rejecting by, for instance, either laying flat or not having children is not the intimacy itself, but what they are rejecting is a pre-written script from the conventional side of the society. They still want to be understood, to be seen, to feel connected to other people, but they just want to do it in their own way. So I feel that is the first thing that what we are seeing in China is a phase that people are kind of like radically looking for new ways of defining their own way of connecting with the society. Like, for example, single motherhood by choice. I think, looking from outside, we probably, look at China at a declining birth rate and coming to the conclusion that Chinese women, they don't want children anymore. But I think from my experience and my understanding, it is not the full picture. I think, of course, there are many women who look at their life, look at their career, look at the kind of life they want to have in the future, and decide, oh, children is not for me. But there are also a lot of women who actually want to have children, but just don't want to have children in the way that the society want them, like getting married, in an exclusive relationship, and living with their parents-in-law so that they could get some childcare, and they don't see that as the only way forward anymore. But they still want to have children. Therefore, single motherhood by choice become a phenomenon. But the reality right now is like in China, if you are a single woman and you want to, for instance, get a sperm from a sperm bank, like a sperm donation from a sperm bank, I think there isn't a easy way to do it. Therefore, a lot of them are seeking ways to do it outside of China. And so that is the second point I want to make. I feel like the sort of freedom or the sort of mentality, desire of wanting freedom like that has arrived, but the support systems haven't fully caught up yet. And therefore, you see a lot of people are doing it on their own way and with very interesting individual practices. And I think thirdly, it is. I think there is also a bigger connection with the with the mental health front. I think when we talk about like intimacy, talking about connection, talking about like new forms of family forming, relationship forming, it's about intimacy, it's about love, about pleasure, but it's also about responsibility, about care. And so what I am seeing is that right now, in this process of redefining what is intimacy, what is the connection we want, there is also some sort of renegotiation of how are we going to share the responsibilities. For instance, about the child rearing, the old script that the children should, shoulder that responsibility on their own without limits is increasingly being questioned. And new possibilities are emerging in terms of, elderly care, like or family care, like hiring professional caregivers and sharing responsibilities among siblings, or simply being able to say to your family that I can't do this alone, I can't do this anymore. So I feel the sort of redefining and renegotiating are still going on. And right now, we probably can see, how each individual cases are going to lead to a bigger societal or policy change. But those individuals are running their experiment, and people who choose, the non-conventional and non-traditional path. Who choose like greater freedom often end up paying some sort of additional emotional labor or psychological labor for that freedom. Okay, I will stop here.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great combination of, kind of, I think, showing us both empowerment and liberation, but also the complexity of this very transitional time, because that also means added stress and sort of uncertainty about what is right and what is wrong. So great window onto and insight onto what's going on there within the family, within individuals. So Yi-Ling, though, one of the things that you've written a lot about is kind of how both in the US and also in China, actually, people are turning to AI chatbots as companions or as therapists, sort of their support mechanism and things like that. Now, you described how technology and AI is both kind of, there's an optimism in China, but also an underlying deep anxiety. What does it mean when people are turning towards the tools that are making them feel anxious, but also as sort of their support mechanism? What are the implications there?
Yeah, I would say the implications are a little alarming. So alarming such that the government has very recently, stepped in to regulate AI companions because of how worried they are about this dependence. I would say, one thing that I've noticed about, and Qing has mentioned about young people in China, is there's a deep-seated need for connection, right? Particularly at this moment when people are feeling isolated. The challenge is that despite this need, people don't have the energy, the motivation, the time, the resources to invest in these relationships, right? Long-term, meaningful relationships take time. And so the easiest solution to this is to outsource that. Right, to outsource it to kind of transactions that people can pay for. And, before the rise of AI, this is stuff like the paleo industry, where you can find an online companion on Taobao, talk to that person for, 20 minutes, kind of relieve that sense of isolation. We see this now in the phenomena of like dazi relationships, these kind of one-off transactional relationships built around a certain activity, right? You can have like a homework dazi, a dining dazi, a travel dazi, where you like do homework with this person, and you feel kind of connected to that person, but then you don't have to like listen to their problems. You don't have to like be a shoulder to cry on. And so, it's kind of solving this need for what has been called shallow affinities, where people can kind of reap the fruits of connection and companionship, but without the friction, the commitment, the kind of conflict and responsibility of taking care of another person. And so AI companions are coming in when people are looking to outsource that connection in a way that they have never, done before in history at this scale. And it's making that kind of large scale, personalized, 24/7 frictionless companionship possible, right? It's being advertised as this like quick fix to the loneliness epidemic. You're feeling sad, you're feeling not understood, just log on to DeepSeek, have like a 3-hour cathartic cry session and everything will be solved. The problem with this is like, this unmet need of wanting to connect and not being understood is not truly met, right? It's being met by something that is frictionless and fake at the end of the day. It's not a genuine relationship being built. And so like one parallel that I can draw, and actually funnily enough was an AI like VC investor who pointed out this metaphor is, like 100 years ago, people lacked calories, like they really needed food, and they didn't have McDonald's and they couldn't eat their fill. But, when McDonald's came around and fast food came around, that led to diabetes. And so now we're in this state of like hunger and need for a certain type of connection. And along comes AI companionship. Like, what is the AI companionship equivalent of diabetes, right? What is that kind of toxic dependency that is formed? And that's something that I am quite worried about, and a lot of people are quite worried about.
Very interesting. So I'm about to purchase the book by Priya Parker, The Art of Gathering. I think gathering and having friction and actually having, real engagement is so important, like you're saying. And so it's also a phenomenon that we see in the U.S. And I think you pointed out that 70% of U.S. Young adolescents perhaps have used AI chatbots for counseling or sort of companions. So it's also a phenomenon here. So Barclay, I want to turn to another dimension of this, which is actually, you've described sort of the turn towards psychology, psy-boom, as describing what might be structural pressures, actual structural issues like inequality, like, toxic work environment, hyper-competitiveness in the economy, as being sort of psychological troubles. So what is I guess part of it can be empowering, but what's sort of an issue you might say in characterizing it that way as psychological trouble, issues that actually have structural foundations?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think to go back to Yi-Ling's earlier point, because the sort of normative good life, as it were, what it means to be living well and to be socially recognized for doing so and to be successful, because it's so narrow and because there are so many people in China, you have this huge mismatch, which creates this intense competition in society. And as we know, there are all of these idioms that people use in China to talk about this sort of involution, this idea of sort of spiraling inwards, because it is so, because the competition is so fierce, you can't get anywhere. This causes people to kind of collapse inwards and to feel this sort of what lots of people call Xinli Kunrao, so like psychological trouble. So it's not a mental illness, but it is this idea of being troubled and to hold these things that you can't really untangle. And so it's not really something that you treat as a clinical issue. So I think it's very important when we talk about mental health, when there are two systems in China, as it were. There's what they call teacher Y and teacher Nei. So teacher Nei, like what is sort of internal to the system, that in the mental health context is anything that is treated in a clinical setting. So that would be psychiatry. So that would be where people are given, SSRIs or potentially, taken into inpatient care if it's particularly serious. Outside of that system, we're talking about private mental health care. So we're talking about people visiting counselors, seeing therapists, attending group therapy sessions, or engaging online in this really dynamic online space, which is now, as Yi-Ling just said, massively exploding with AI. So even before the pandemic, so even in 2018, 2019, 2020, which is the main years that I was doing my PhD research, you had these huge WeChat accounts that were super popular, followed by millions of people that were publishing articles about mental health and about psychology. And that's where these terms like psychological troubles were really popular. And what was interesting was you would read some of these articles. And so you would read like an article on a big psychology platform, and the article title would be something like, "My boyfriend was outside the office, but I had to email him to go home." And the whole article is about this girl sat at her desk wanting to see her boyfriend, but it's 10 p.m. Her boss has just told her she has to continue working. She has to email him to go home. What is she supposed to do about it? And the problem is, that is a structural problem, right? People are working too hard. That's the whole issue of evolution. But here, the structure of the article, the way this is being framed, is what can you do psychologically when you're faced with a situation like this? How can you self-heal? And there would be many articles about various aspects of society, things that could very easily bleed into issues that we would consider to be political, like unfairness, inequality, the inability to succeed, the very nature of the fact that the normative good life is so circumscribed. Many of these issues are political in nature, but because China is not a system that has democracy, because there's no real way to form political agency to change these systems, where do you go? And in a system where your political agency is foreclosed, one of the things that I think happens is people turn inwards. And so what has happened with the rise of psychology is psychology gives people this sense of agency. And it is a real sense of agency because, I can't control all of these various things in my life, but I can control my response to them. And so it does create for individuals a sense of agency. And so that's why many people respond very positively to their encounters in the psy-boom, broadly, whether that's seeing a therapist for the first time, reading a psychology book, attending a lecture by a famous psychotherapist, or any number of ways that they would engage with psychology or psychological knowledge, and to think of themselves as a psychological subject whose emotions and responses they are actually in control of. And so they're not just being beaten around by these huge structural forces that they can't control. The one thing they can control is their response. Allegedly, of course, because, no one has full control over their emotional responses all the time. But this sense of agency on an individual level is empowering. But if you take this further on an externalized level, and if everyone is just turning inwards, then this can create tolerance and permission for great inequality. And that is also a critique that is made of mental health, of the kind of individualized mental health care as it is practiced in the West, right? And that's why many people are very skeptical of, say, Google having meditation rooms and stuff. Does that help with burnout, or does that just allow your workers to kind of turn inwards and keep grinding?
Very cool. Yeah. Sort of the double-edged sword of the, need for psychological relief, but also what that means for the collective life and maybe the political agency that people have over structural pressures. But Yi-Ling, you've written very elegantly in Wall Dancers, your book, about how, people who are maybe don't quite fit into the mainstream, structures, who maybe are sort of on the outside looking in, might be finding connection in the internet space. Can you give us a picture onto how that's working and what you found in your research?
Yeah, I would say, also what I found has changed quite radically over the period of the last 5 years. Even since publication, things look very different. But yeah, my book, The Wall Dancers, it really is centered around this phrase, dancing in shackles, right? This idea that it's possible to kind of find creativity, find agency, even when kind of put within constraints, be it political or economic. And so one of the kind of communities that I follow in particular is the queer community. And I follow a young tech entrepreneur called Ali, who creates Blued, which becomes the largest gay dating app in China and in the world for a period of time. And for decades, Blued really served as a place where kind of young queer men could connect with one another, often for the first time. And they could do so in a kind of political environment that has increasingly become quite rigid and constrained for queer communities in China. And what has shifted, unfortunately, over the period of time that I've written this book is that Blued has since then taken down app stores. It no longer necessarily functions as this space for young queer Chinese in the way that it did before. But these spaces still exist. They just jump elsewhere. So a lot of like young Gen Z queer people that I speak to are now saying, we don't use Blued, that's for the older generation. Like we're on Douyin, or like we're on Red Note, right? Or we've established like underground voguing dances in and like but we connect with with each other through these like WeChat threads. And so I guess one thing that I've found is even when kind of systems of control, technological systems of control are becoming increasingly tighter and increasingly more rigid, people continue to find these like pockets of spaces, both offline and online, where they dance, or when I say dance, I mean like carve out spaces of kind of freedom and dignity, even when it's becoming increasingly difficult.
Right. Such a complicated picture of empowerment, of creativity, of sort of dynamism, but also there is a repressive edge. There's a way in which you can't actually collectively organize because they're very different systems. So, but Barclay, I'm really struck by, because as someone who's looking on into China's sort of stratospheric technological rise, the impression for many people, I think, is that there is this techno-optimism in China that's different from, let's say, Europe or the US, where there's a lot more sort of pessimism about AI. There's a backlash against data centers in the US at this point. But then also this, what we just heard now, that actually underlying it is a lot of sort of, pessimism or anxieties being harvested by the future, as Yi-Ling said in one of her writings. So how does that dynamic work? Like in your observation among the younger generation, how do those sort of dichotomies, is it a dichotomy? Do they coexist with one another? And what are sort of the implications of that tension?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a bit of a category error. So I think basically when people say, oh, Chinese people are much more techno-optimist than people in the West, they point to, the adoption rates of AI, the number of people who say AI is useful for me. But there's sort of, this is something that Xiang Biao, who we've mentioned earlier, this, one of the world's top anthropologists, has spoken about in a context, in a previous context of technological change in China, which is the idea of the last bus. And so you don't want to miss the last bus out of the station. And so if you're in a context of unbelievable competition, and the competition in this era, when you have really high rates of youth unemployment, is even more fierce than the era that Xiang Biao was writing about, which was the early 2000s. So if you have this really intense competition today, of course, people are going to use every single technology at their advantage to make sure that they get ahead and that they crucially don't get left behind. And so I think many people see China and think, it's very techno optimistic. People are racing to employ AI. Look at OpenClaw, which is the agent, the agent that can use your telephone. They have a sign-up party outside of the headquarters in Shenzhen. Thousands of people turn up. You see, look how techno-optimist they are. They're not shutting down data centers. Well, number one, good luck mobilizing against a data center in China. Good luck mobilizing in general. It's very hard to do that. And number two, you run to the OpenClaw office, not because you're desperate to have an AI agent on your phone, but because you're very worried that if all your neighbors have an AI agent on your phone, they're going to get ahead, they're going to get the few jobs, and you're going to be left behind. So it's not quite the same. It's not the same as feeling like, yes, I live in a utopia and AI is going to solve all the problems. We're going to live in hyperabundance. It doesn't mean that the average Chinese person thinks like a tech billionaire from Silicon Valley. Many of them are very, very anxious, actually, about the idea that AI might take their job, or the idea that they're not, in the future, is anyone going to have work? What is this going to look like? How are we going to survive this? How am I going to have kids? What does this mean? I mean, all of those anxieties can coexist with a really high adoption rate of AI, but that is not because you love the technology necessarily. It's because the technology is the necessary evil to get ahead, I think. So I think it's a bit of a category error there.
Yeah. I think as Yi-Ling describes through the Gaokao, there's very narrow channels for actually making it onto the next level. And so it's the same story here. You need to catch the bus or you're going to be left behind. So, but Cheng, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. And I mean, just to say, I do think if you grew up in China, from the 1980s onwards, technology has unbelievably progressed society. I mean, you can't deny that the China of today is unbelievably advanced compared to the China of 1980, and that this modernity has been compressed into sort of 40 plus years compared to the 200-300 years of the West. And so that does obviously give a lot of people a sense that, forward momentum and growth, technology broadly good. So I do think that can be true, but I think specifically with AI, it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah. Thanks for giving us a window onto the complexity of that. So, and Cheng, I know in one of your podcasts, you actually had someone come and speak about, sort of the underlying structure of how AI is built and sort of the actual sort of a systemic kind of construction of that. I was wondering if you could sort of give us a window onto that. And then separately, like your podcast, as you said, you've had guests on there who speak about things that young people are thinking about. Many of your episodes on mental health issues and whatnot have really kind of been the most popular ones. What is the role that podcasts can play as a mental health infrastructure in China?
Oh, well. Yeah, I mean, it feels good to have the possibility to be on the infrastructure side, and I really hope that podcast like medium could eventually play some roles in there. I think so podcasting in China started, especially the independent podcasting scene in China, I think started roughly around the same time when COVID started. So I think from day one, it sort of had a quite different route compared to the American one, because I think a lot of the American one, when it started out, it has a lot of resources or supports from institutional media, and that sort of still follow through the media reporting path. But I think Chinese one, almost from day one, when it start becoming a thing in China, it always also serves as a community. So as a podcast, you put out episode, invite people on your show to talk about interesting topics, and then you form a community with your audiences. And I think some of the more advanced Chinese podcasting app, like the 小宇宙 Little Universe, also specifically worked on that function. So you, as a podcaster, you get like immediate feedback from the comment session, which I think right now neither Apple Podcasts or Spotify actually provide sufficiently. So I think therefore there has always been a sense of, if you listen to the same podcast, then you are sort of belong to the same community. So I think what it does to this like collective mental health issue is that podcast and the community around it offers some sort of collective language that destigmatize mental illness issue, or like Barclay said, mental like psychological troubling. And it also offers a sense of a shared experience that one can feel recognized. When someone realizes, what I have been going through can actually be put in words like this, or other people have suffered from similar things, then that reduce, that ease the loneliness in it. And I think that's kind of like the first step towards healing. And I see not just podcasts, but also a lot of like similar online community or offline community also serve in this kind of function. So you do something together collectively, and that itself provides a sense of healing. One interesting phenomenon I think in China recent years is the rise of doing feng shui or tarot card or astrology, like Yi-Ling mentioned, that is happening in Silicon Valley right now. I think there's also a phenomenon becoming a sort of like collective initiative for people who are seeking for either like companionship and also for some sort of recognition with like-minded people. And then coming back to the AI front, I will be very quick as we are reaching the end. I think so. The episode we did was like to discuss, what kind of human labor are actually behind the AI system that is being built and being used by everyone right now. And if we are facing the AI software in front of us, it's very easy for us to forget that there still are like real human behind it, like to add to the database and to correct the stereotype, and all that human labors not being discussed enough. And therefore, how we as the users of those systems, how we define our relationship to those software. So we are still like somehow in a way connecting to another human, but through a hyper complicated AI system that we actually forgot there is still human on the other side. And so what I see right now is like in terms of the meaning searching, there still are a lot of like desire for people who are exclusively seeking for connection with sort of like a system or communities that are without AI, and that itself is now becoming, I think, in some community that becoming some sort of a label for the community that we are a community, but we are sort of the AI proof. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think some of the trends that we see in both countries, maybe around the world, regarding escapism to back to the land kind of movements and sort of idyllic kind of off the grid, going to rural areas, is happening, I know, in the US, but also in China and, well, probably in Europe as well. So to remember the human behind the AI machine is a very good reminder that there's a whole system behind what's being built that's actually not just technology. So thank you for that reminder as well. Well, this was a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. I think we added a lot of depth to something that people can just kind of gloss over because often the rhetoric is around competition within US and China. So thank you very much for joining us, and would love to continue this conversation as we go forward as well. So thanks very much.